Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Imagine agreeing to a fake marriage for a business deal. But soon, what you thought was a simple contract turns into something far more real than you ever expected. Can a relationship built on lies ever lead to true love? Stay tuned to find out. We meet Mark Davis, a young law student barely scraping by. At 23, he had a lot on his plate: final year of law school, part-time jobs, and mounting debt left by his late father. Mark had always been responsible, trying to balance his responsibilities, but today felt heavier than usual. The phone call he received that morning wasn't helping either. The voice on the other end was calm, but firm. Mark frowned. He didn't recognize the name. Eleanor Brooks? How did she know about his debts? How did she know about him? But he couldn't afford to ignore the call. He answered quickly. The voice on the other end didn't miss a beat. The call ended abruptly, leaving Mark more confused than before. Who was this woman, and why did she want to meet him? He tried to shake it off, but something about the tone in her voice made him uneasy. He glanced at the clock. It was almost time. With no better option, he decided to go. Mark arrived at the bistro, a cozy, upscale place known for its warm lighting and quiet ambience. He was drenched from the rain, his jacket barely doing its job against the cold. The place felt a little too fancy for him, but he was too exhausted to care. He shook off the discomfort and walked inside. At a corner table sat Eleanor, a striking woman in her early 70s, with silver hair perfectly styled and a tailored suit that screamed power. She was looking down at her phone, seemingly oblivious to Mark's presence. He approached her table, his mind racing. She looked up at him, her piercing blue eyes sharp, yet welcoming. Mark sat down, still trying to make sense of everything. Eleanor didn't waste time on small talk. She got straight to the point. Mark blinked, unsure if he heard her right. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. He thought he had misunderstood her. Marriage? To her? But Eleanor's expression was serious, and her tone brooked no argument. Mark was silent for a moment, processing what she had just proposed. It felt too surreal, but then, his reality sank in. He had no other choice. His mother's medical bills, his sister's tuition, everything depended on him agreeing to something as outrageous as this. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes softening just a fraction. Mark's mind raced. He wanted to say no, to walk away, but his heart sank at the thought of his family's future. Eleanor wasn't offering him love, but she was offering him everything else: money, security, a life beyond his current struggles. He took a deep breath, glancing at the contract she had placed in front of him. This wasn't romantic, this wasn't ideal, but it was a way out. The faintest of smiles tugged at Eleanor's lips. She stood up, extending her hand to him. Mark had never imagined he would be sitting across from a woman like Eleanor Brooks in a place like this. The moment they left the bistro, Eleanor led him to a lawyer's office, where they finalized the details of the contract marriage. It all felt like a dream or maybe a nightmare. Eleanor, with her commanding presence and sharp eyes, didn't seem to have any reservations about the situation, but Mark? He was conflicted, unsure if he was making the right decision. Yet, deep down, he knew he had no choice. He needed the money, and this was the only option available to him. As Eleanor handed him the pen, the weight of the decision hit him. Was he really about to sign away his life for a sum of money that might save his family? The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and silent agreement. Eleanor arranged everything: the house, the security, the support for his family. Mark moved into her luxurious mansion, a stark contrast to the cramped apartment he had shared with his mother and sister. The mansion was cold, immaculate, and empty, its pristine white walls echoing a life he had never known. It was a far cry from the small, lived-in space he had left behind. He spent his days adjusting to the high society life that Eleanor had introduced him to, learning to navigate her world of galas, charity events, and corporate dinner. The life he had once dreamed of, but never imagined he would have access to, was now his. But as time passed, Mark couldn't help but feel like a stranger in his own life. He was, after all, living a lie. Eleanor had made it clear from the beginning that this was a business arrangement, and Mark had agreed, hoping that the financial stability it promised would be worth the emotional emptiness that followed. They hardly saw each other outside of the public appearances they had to attend. Their interactions were limited to brief exchanges in the mansion or at events. Eleanor was polite, but distant. And Mark, though grateful for the financial support, couldn't shake the feeling that he was being used. He had no idea where this arrangement would take him, but deep down, he was starting to question if the price of security was worth the cost of his peace of mind. One evening, after another charity gala, Eleanor and Mark found themselves in the mansion's grand dining room. The evening had been long, filled with forced smiles, obligatory handshakes, and endless small talk. Eleanor had been the picture of grace and poise, the perfect socialite, but Mark had felt like a fish out of water. The weight of the situation was finally beginning to wear on him. Eleanor sat across from him, sipping her wine, her expression unreadable. It was then that Mark decided to speak up. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her eyes flicking over to him. Eleanor's gaze softened, but only slightly. She set her wineglass down and folded her hands in front of her. Mark nodded, but something in her words didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was the growing distance between them, the loneliness that came from living with someone who treated the relationship like a business transaction. For the first time, Eleanor looked at him with something resembling empathy. She leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. There was a long silence between them, and for the first time since they'd met, Mark felt like he was finally seeing the real Eleanor. She wasn't just a powerful, intimidating woman who had everything. She was also someone who had been forced into a corner, someone who was just as vulnerable as he was. Maybe they weren't so different after all. As they sat there in the quiet of the mansion, Eleanor and Mark both realized that this arrangement had become more complicated than they'd anticipated. What had started as a simple business deal had turned into something neither of them expected. Mark wasn't just a husband in name anymore. He was becoming something more, something real. But for Mark, the question remained, could he ever trust Eleanor? Could he let go of the idea that their marriage was just a business transaction and allow it to become something more? Or would he always see it for what it started, a deal that had cost him more than he had bargained for? Weeks passed since Mark's conversation with Eleanor, and while the tension between them hadn't exactly dissolved, something had shifted. The house, once a cold, impersonal place, now felt slightly warmer, though it was still far from home. Mark had settled into his new life, sort of. He spent most of his time trying to adjust to the whirlwind of charity events, public dinners, and meetings Eleanor had set up for him. It was a life filled with luxury, but it still felt like a facade. Eleanor was often distant, but more often than not, she would offer him a kind word or two in private, even if it was just for the sake of maintaining the appearance of a happy couple. One afternoon, Mark was sitting alone in his study, staring at a mountain of paperwork, feeling the weight of the life he had agreed to. The noise of the mansion seemed to fade as he lost himself in his thoughts. He had been thinking about Eleanor a lot lately, wondering what she truly wanted from him. Was she really as cold as she appeared? Or was there more to her than the stoic, businesswoman persona she presented to the world? He couldn't deny the moments when he saw glimpses of vulnerability in her eyes, when she let her guard down just enough to show that she was, in fact, human. It was a quiet day when he received an unexpected message from Eleanor. It was a simple invitation, just a few words, asking him to join her for dinner in the grand dining room. No grand event. No cameras. Just the two of them. At first, Mark was hesitant. He had become used to their routine brief, transactional exchanges, and that was about it. But something about the invitation tugged at him. Maybe it was the curiosity or the faint hope that tonight might be different. He decided to go. When he arrived at the dining room, Eleanor was already sitting at the table, a glass of wine in hand. The room was dimly lit, and the setting felt more intimate than the cold, formal dinners they usually attended. She was dressed simply, no extravagant jewelry or over-the-top attire, just a soft, navy dress that hugged her figure. Her eyes softened when she saw him, but there was something different in the way she looked at him. She wasn't the businesswoman anymore. She wasn't the cold, unapproachable figure that had once intimidated him. Mark hesitated, but he sat across from her. It was strange. There was something about her tone that made him feel both uneasy and intrigued. Eleanor smiled, a faint, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mark was silent for a moment, unsure of what to say. The vulnerability in her words was disarming, and he found himself leaning forward, listening more intently. Mark blinked, caught off guard by her words. He had always thought of Eleanor as someone who had everything, someone who was in control of her life. To hear her speak so candidly about loss and regret made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about her. Eleanor's gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw the depth of pain in her eyes. It was a look that startled him, a vulnerability he hadn't expected from the woman who had seemed so untouchable. Mark sat there, stunned. He didn't know what to say, how to respond to her. All he had known was the cold, calculated Eleanor. But now, he was faced with a woman who was not only admitting her mistakes, but also showing the kind of raw honesty he had never expected from her. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet, but profound silence. For the first time, they didn't talk about business or appearances. They simply shared their stories, their regrets, and their hopes. It wasn't the perfect conversation. It wasn't a grand gesture or a declaration of love. But it was real, something they had both longed for, even if they hadn't realized it until now. As Mark left the dinner that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. Eleanor had shown him a side of herself he never expected, and for the first time, he didn't just see her as a businesswoman or a distant, cold figure. He saw her as a person, with hopes, fears, and regrets just like him. And maybe, just maybe, this marriage wasn't as much of a business transaction as he once thought. The next few days were filled with an awkward but undeniable shift in the dynamic between Mark and Eleanor. They began to spend more time together, but it was different now. There was no longer any pretending. No more just going through the motions for the sake of appearances. The walls between them had cracked, and though they both tried to deny it, a real connection was beginning to form. Mark had never thought that a marriage based on a contract could evolve into anything more. But after that quiet dinner, he started to wonder if it was possible for something real to grow from the ashes of what they'd agreed upon. Eleanor wasn't the cold, distant businesswoman he thought she was, and he wasn't just a pawn in her game anymore. They were two people who, despite their differences, shared a sense of longing for something they didn't have. One afternoon, Eleanor surprised Mark with a visit to a local art gallery. It wasn't a place they'd typically go for business, but something about it seemed different, personal. She had mentioned once that she liked art, but Mark had never taken her words seriously. She often kept her true interests hidden behind her polished exterior, but today, she seemed eager to share something of herself. Mark listened carefully, his eyes following her as she moved through the exhibit. He had never seen her like this, so vulnerable, so open. For the first time since they'd met, he realized just how much she had been hiding beneath that stoic mask. He watched her as she admired a painting of a landscape at sunset, the vibrant colors reflecting a world of hope and possibility. The beauty in the piece seemed to stir something deep inside of her. Mark was taken aback. He hadn't expected her to ask such a personal question, especially not here, in the space of raw emotion. But somehow, he felt like it was a safe place to be honest. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the gallery, both of them lost in thought. For the first time, Mark felt like they were on the same page. Maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't over yet. Eleanor finally broke the silence, turning to face him with a small, uncertain smile. Mark shook his head, taking a step closer to her. Her eyes softened as she looked at him. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something that hadn't been there before. She stepped closer, their proximity no longer filled with tension or uncertainty, but with the potential for something new. Mark's heart began to race. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to find himself standing here, in this quiet gallery, with Eleanor, someone he had initially thought of as distant and unreachable, offering him a chance at something real. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what their future would look like. But in that moment, he knew one thing for sure: there was more to this than just a contract. As they left the gallery together, the sky was painted with the colors of the setting sun, and Mark couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, they were on the verge of something new. Something they both had been searching for. They walked side by side, not as husband and wife by obligation, but as two people who had found a connection they couldn't ignore. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor found themselves in uncharted territory. The initial awkwardness of their marriage had faded, replaced by something neither of them had expected: genuine companionship. They still had their disagreements, their silent moments, but there was an undeniable shift in their dynamic. They were beginning to understand each other in ways they hadn't thought possible. Eleanor was no longer just a businesswoman to Mark, and he was no longer just a means to an end for her. They were becoming something more: a partnership, but also something that felt like a real marriage. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their mansion, sipping wine and watching the sun dip below the horizon, Eleanor turned to Mark with a question she hadn't asked before. It wasn't a question about their business arrangement, nor was it about the future of their contract. This question came from a place of real curiosity, the kind that only comes when two people start to see beyond their roles and begin to connect. Mark looked at her, the question hanging in the air. For a moment, he was speechless. He had never allowed himself to think about what life could be like outside the boundaries of their agreement. Everything had always been about survival, about doing what was necessary to make ends meet. But now, as he sat there with Eleanor, the thought of starting fresh seemed almost possible. Her eyes softened as she listened to him, the walls that had once been so firmly in place between them beginning to crumble. They had started this relationship as a deal, a contract signed out of necessity, but now it felt like they were both on the brink of something new, something real. Mark's heart raced at the question. Could they be happy? Could he really let go of everything he had believed about this arrangement and embrace the possibility of real happiness with her? He wasn't sure, but for the first time in a long while, he was willing to take the chance. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the colors of the sky change as the evening turned to night. There was no rush, no pressure. Just the two of them, sharing a moment of clarity. The next few days brought more change. They began spending more time together outside of the public eye, in the privacy of their home. Eleanor showed Mark parts of her life that were once hidden, from her favorite books to the music that had always comforted her. She allowed herself to be vulnerable in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. And Mark, for the first time, allowed himself to be someone other than the man who was just trying to survive. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Eleanor surprised Mark by asking him to join her for a quiet dinner at home. It wasn't a grand affair, just a simple meal, but it felt more intimate than any of the fancy gala events they had attended. As they ate, they talked about their pasts, their dreams, and their fears. They spoke as equals, no longer bound by the contract that had originally brought them together. I used to think that love was something that just happened, something you couldn't control, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. But now I think love is something you choose. Something you work at. And I think I want to choose it with you, Mark. Mark's heart swelled as he heard her words. They weren't just words anymore. They were a promise that they could build something real, something that was not just about business or survival, but about love and connection. I want that too, he said, his voice steady with conviction. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you, not because we have to, but because we choose to. In that moment, they both knew that whatever their future held, it would be different from the life they had known before. They had begun this journey as strangers, bound by a contract. But now, they were partners who had discovered something deeper than just a marriage of convenience. They had found something real. As the evening came to a close, Mark and Eleanor shared a quiet moment, knowing that they were no longer just playing a role. They were truly starting over, together. As the weeks went by, Mark and Eleanor's connection grew deeper, though they both still approached it with caution. They had broken through the walls of their marriage of convenience, but that didn't mean everything was suddenly perfect. The complexities of their pasts, the unspoken fears, and the scars of their previous lives still lingered between them, though they were slowly learning how to navigate them together. One afternoon, Eleanor asked Mark to join her at a charity event. It wasn't the type of event they had previously attended, grand and extravagant, but a smaller gathering at a local community center. It was for a cause that was important to Eleanor, one that she had supported for years. Mark was surprised when she invited him, as he was still adjusting to his new life. But he agreed, eager to learn more about what truly mattered to her. At the event, Eleanor was different. She wasn't the polished, composed businesswoman that Mark had first met. Instead, she was engaged, passionate, and, for the first time, completely at ease in a setting that had nothing to do with business or appearances. She spoke with the people there like she had known them for years, her warmth and genuine care for the cause clear in every conversation. Mark watched her from the side, a growing sense of admiration swelling in his chest. He had seen her as a woman of power and control, but now he saw her as something more, someone who, despite everything, cared deeply about the world around her. He couldn't help but smile as he saw the light in her eyes when she spoke about the charity's work. Later that evening, as they walked back to their car, Eleanor glanced over at him, a quiet smile on her lips. Mark shrugged, a little shy about how much it truly did mean to him. Eleanor's smile faltered just slightly, her eyes reflecting something deeper. Mark felt a pang in his chest, understanding exactly what she meant. He had done the same thing, putting aside his own desires and dreams for the sake of survival. But in that moment, he realized that he and Eleanor were starting to see each other in ways they never had before. They were no longer just playing a part. They were beginning to share something real, something they both desperately needed but had been too afraid to admit. As the days turned into weeks, they continued to grow closer. They still had their moments of doubt, their quiet disagreements, but there was no longer any pretense between them. Mark no longer saw Eleanor as just the woman who had offered him a way out of his financial troubles. He saw her as someone he could care for, someone who had more to offer than just her wealth and power. And Eleanor, in turn, began to see Mark not just as her contract husband, but as someone who had become an unexpected anchor in her life. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony, enjoying a rare quiet moment, Mark turned to Eleanor with something he hadn't yet said out loud. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her gaze curious but not judgmental. For the first time, Eleanor's eyes softened with something like relief, but there was also a hint of fear in them. Mark took her hand in his, holding it gently as he spoke. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her gaze steady but full of uncertainty. In that moment, Mark realized that they had both taken a huge leap. They had gone from two strangers bound by a contract to two people who were starting to open their hearts to each other. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. As they sat together on the balcony, the city lights sparkling in the distance, they both understood that their journey was just beginning. It wasn't the story they had expected, but it was one they were willing to write together. And for the first time, both of them were ready to turn the page. As weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor found themselves at a crossroads. The feelings they had once tried to ignore were now undeniable, but with those feelings came new challenges. They were no longer just playing the roles they had agreed to at the start. Their marriage, which had begun as a simple business arrangement, was now something deeper, more complicated. Eleanor, who had spent most of her life maintaining control over every aspect of her world, now found herself navigating emotions she had kept buried for years. And Mark, who had never thought he would be in a position to have more than just a transactional relationship, was faced with the reality of wanting something real and the fear that he might lose it. One evening, as they sat together in the garden of their home, the conversation turned toward their future. Eleanor had always been the one to keep her emotions guarded, but tonight, something in the air had changed. She was quieter than usual, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her glass as she stared out into the garden. Mark sat up, sensing the shift in her tone. He turned toward her, his heart racing as he waited for her to continue. Eleanor took a deep breath, then looked at him, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized how much Eleanor had been holding back until now. His instincts told him she wasn't just talking about him, but about her own fears and past wounds that had kept her guarded for so long. Mark reached out, taking her hand gently in his. His thumb brushed over her knuckles as he spoke, his voice full of sincerity. The silence between them felt heavy, but it was a comfortable kind of weight. For the first time, they were both admitting their fears, their vulnerabilities. It was the first step towards something real, something they hadn't expected to find in each other, but something they both desperately needed. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Mark nodded, his expression unwavering. For a long moment, they sat in the stillness, their hands clasped together. The world around them seemed to fade away as they simply existed in the quiet understanding that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they were no longer just partners in a contract. They were partners in something more. Something real. And for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe it. That maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. As the night settled in around them, Mark and Eleanor shared a quiet moment, knowing that their journey was far from over. There were still obstacles to face, still fears to conquer, but they were no longer facing them alone. They had each other, and that was enough for now. Mark and Eleanor had come a long way since the early days of their arrangement. What had begun as a cold, transactional marriage had transformed into something neither of them had expected. There were still moments of uncertainty, times when they questioned if what they had was real, but each day brought them closer to understanding that maybe, just maybe, they had found something deeper than either had dared to hope for. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was enough. One evening, as they sat in the grand living room of their home, the flickering fire casting a warm glow over the room, Eleanor turned to Mark, her expression thoughtful. Mark looked at her, his heart pounding slightly in his chest. He had been thinking about the same thing, but hearing her speak about it made it feel all the more real. Eleanor smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. Mark squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles over her skin. "I understand," he said. "I've spent so much time focused on survival that I didn't know what I was missing until now. But now that I see it, I don't want to lose it." There was a long pause, the weight of their words hanging in the air between them. Mark's heart swelled with a mix of relief and hope. For the first time, he truly felt like they were on the same page. They had both been afraid of opening up to each other, but now they were admitting that what they had was real, and they both wanted to hold on to it. Eleanor paused again, her eyes meeting his with a sincerity he had never seen before. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had known that they had come a long way, but hearing her say it out loud, hearing her express what he had only hoped for, made it feel like a dream. Eleanor nodded, her expression firm and confident. Mark smiled, the weight in his chest lifting. He knew that they still had challenges to face, that life would never be simple. But in that moment, he realized that they didn't need to have all the answers. They didn't need to know exactly what the future held. What mattered was that they were in this together, and that was more than enough. As they sat there, hand in hand, they both understood that this was just the beginning. There would be ups and downs, there would be moments of doubt and fear, but they were ready to face it all together. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a sense of peace. He had never imagined that he would find this kind of love, but now that he had, he was ready to fight for it. The fire crackled in the background, and as they sat there, looking toward a future they would build side by side, they both knew that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. And that was all they needed. Months had passed since that quiet evening when Eleanor and Mark had acknowledged the real connection between them. Their journey had been anything but ordinary, filled with doubts, fears, and unexpected moments of clarity. But now, as they sat together in the garden once again, everything felt different. The air between them was lighter, filled with hope, and the weight of uncertainty no longer felt as heavy. They had faced their pasts, their insecurities, and had come out stronger on the other side, united. Mark watched as Eleanor smiled softly, the warm sunlight casting a glow on her face. For the first time, she seemed completely at ease, not the guarded businesswoman he had met all those months ago, but a woman who had found her way back to the things that truly mattered. Mark felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at her. He had never imagined that this marriage, which had started as nothing more than a way out of financial trouble, would turn into something so meaningful. Something real. But here they were, facing each other with a newfound understanding. They both fell silent for a moment, taking in the enormity of what they had both admitted. The quiet of the garden surrounded them, but it was no longer uncomfortable or filled with uncertainty. It felt like a beginning, a new chapter. As the evening sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the world, Mark turned to Eleanor, his eyes filled with warmth. Eleanor's eyes sparkled as she gazed back at him, her smile growing wider. In that moment, it was clear to both of them that they had found something rare, a partnership that was built not just on need, but on real love, trust, and understanding. They had started as strangers, bound by a contract, but somewhere along the way, they had built something that was far beyond any agreement they had made. As they stood up and walked hand in hand toward the house, Mark stopped for a moment and looked at Eleanor. There was no grand gesture, no flashy display of affection, but in that quiet moment, Mark knew what he needed to do. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she simply stared at him, her eyes wide in surprise. But then, without a word, she nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Mark smiled, a wave of relief and joy sweeping over him. They were no longer just two people trying to make a marriage work out of obligation. They were partners, and this time, it was for real. For love. For everything they had fought for. And as they embraced, the world around them seemed to fade away. The past, the fears, and the doubts, all of it seemed insignificant now. They had found each other, and that was enough. In the quiet of that evening, Mark and Eleanor realized that their journey was only beginning. The road ahead might still be uncertain, but with each other by their side, they were ready to face whatever came next. Because now, they were no longer just partners by chance. They were partners by choice, and that was the greatest thing of all.